Shalom. This is your brother Ibad, Banyan Zakar from True Nation Congregation in Fresno. And Lord willing, this lesson will be edifying. As we get closer to the memorial Simon, we're going to cover some of the works of Simon and his descendants. So, Lord willing, this lesson will be edifying. I start off first by sharing my screen. Okay. And we'll go to my image. Okay. Boom. All right, so we're going to cover some things having to do with the conquest of Simon, right? About him and his early expansion, recapturing some of our territories, right? Because we see that, the Maccabean revolt kicked off with the father, followed by Judas, Jonathan, which was very skilled in diplomacy, right? And then falling to Simon, a man of wise counsel, so everything was written aforetime for our learning also, but we have to search, the way of our forefathers and the ancients. When we can't find stories or scriptures that were written, we have to check extra sources, right? Like you could find stuff in the works of Flavius Josephus, the Wars of Antiquity, right? So the scripture tells us, search the ways of our ancestors, right? So let me get that first. Bear with me as I share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to go to the scriptures. Okay. All right. So we'll start off by going to Job chapter 8 and verse 8. We're just going to do this smooth, nice and smooth. All right. Hold on, baby. Daddy's doing a video right now. All right. Job chapter 8 and verse 8. And it reads, look for a moment at ancient wisdom. Consider the truth our ancestors learned, right? And so, like, many of our ancestors learned, these truths by, talking to each other, the research, right? The law, statutes, commandments passed to each other because not everybody had a scroll that they could read off. So oftentimes they learned and recopied it and taught each other, so oftentimes we have to look, right, and search out the way of our ancestors by looking at historical references, right? Checking, the credibility of those authors, upon precepts, of course, but the scriptures tells us to do that. So, we know that we're able to look at history and put things together, right? Chew up the meat, spit up the bones, so to speak, right? So, let's see here. All right. Simon Maccabees, right? Simon's military conquest and early expansion of the Hasmonean state. The Hasmoneans, right? Called the Maccabees because the war hammer, they destroyed, right? But hammer is also built. It's a tool. It could be a tool for destruction, right? The Maccabees brothers didn't play. Simon, a man of wise counsel, right? There was peace during Simon's time. These are just some things that we've got to consider, right? His wars with Bachides, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Demetrius, amongst many others. And when they were in war, they oftentimes picked political sides and revolved, alliances with different people, right? According to what, benefited them at the time, right? So we start off by Simon extending our territory, right? And it reads, Simon secured his position as Judah's leader and high priest. He set out to expand his realm by attacking Judea's principle to lose his strongholds. So let's go to the scriptures. Okay. And we'll go to First Maccabees chapter 14. Praises Simon. And we'll take it from verse 4 through 6. And it reads, the land of Judea was at peace as long as Simon lived. During his entire reign, he used his position of power and influence to do what was good for his people, and they were always pleased with him as their ruler, right? And so a lot of that comes with, alliances, relationships, checking everything out from all angles, right? Going to war when it's a must, when it's required, right? Which getting that wisdom and forming alliances, right? But we do see that, with some of these alliances that were formed, they backfire, because strength comes from the Most High God, just like what Judas said, right? Judas Maccabees, strength comes from the Father. So let's continue and reading, finish the reading here. He added to his reputation when he captured the port of Joppa and opened the route to the Greek islands. He not only enlarged the territory of his nation and gained control of the whole country, but he brought back many prisoners of war and captured Gezer, Bezer, and the fort of Jerusalem and purified the fort, and there was no one to oppose him. So this man did many great works that we could read about, right? It says, he attacked at some of those Seleucid strongholds, right? He first campaigned against Gezer, which was ideally situated to use as a base for expeditions in the coastal plain. So, and it said that he took, control of Joppa, right? And we see that right here, controlling the routes to the Greek islands, right? So that was very important at that time, which is still important now, all these ports that we have, right? Maritime export and import. So, and we read the expeditions to the coastal plain, right? And we could find in First Maccabees chapter 9, verse 52, the site already possessed a Seleucid garrison, right? So our forefathers were taking over these garrisons just like the heathen was raiding our temples, right? And oftentimes we took over their garrisons and we took over their, what are those called? Engines of war, siege towers, catapults, things of that sort, right? So it says, he wrestled the city with observant and took Jews and stationed Hyrcanus there, the commander of all his forces, right? So we were taking control of garrisons. We were putting in that work. We took fortresses, right? Bacchides fortress, to name, just a few. We go to First Maccabees chapter 9, and we'll take it from verse 49 to 52. Okay. Read. Verse 49 through 52. All right. It reads, that day, Bacchides lost about 1,000 men. After Bacchides returned to Jerusalem, the Syrians built fortifications with high walls and barred gates for a number of towns in Judea: Amos, Beth Horon, Bethel, Timnah, Parathon, Tephon, and the fortress in Jericho. And all these he placed troops to harass the Jews. So this heathen came and, just took over our land. And we constantly had to fight and defend our land. And at the same time, we had our own people that was turning against our people, right? That's the reason why, hey, the Maccabees brothers didn't spare them. They were killed too, right? So we continue reading that he was harassing our people. He also, verse 52, he also strengthened the fortifications of the towns of Bezer and Gezer and the fort in Jerusalem. He placed his army units there and stored up supplies there. Then he took the sons of the leading men of the country as hostages and imprisoned them in the fort. So, we see that they're going to war with Bacchides. Bacchides lost men. Then Bacchides would come and build his fortifications in our areas, right? So we continue reading. Excuse me, bear with me for a second. The decision of Simon to place Hyrcanus as commander of his military was instrumental in preserving the independence of the Hasmonean state. Weapons of the neighboring Hellenistic armies is perhaps a principal reason for Simon's military successes, right? So we see that, our people had to use wisdom, just like how they didn't fight on the Sabbath. Whatever weapons that they had, we would take and possess those things. Okay. It also helps to explain the concessions Demetrius II and Sidetes granted him. The Hasmoneans were too formidable a military power for the Syrians to oppose at this time. The text supports this assertion. According to 1 Maccabees chapter 13, verse 43, Simon constructed a large shooting tower and a breaching device known as a helepolis, right? So we see, that he was building these engines of war, right? And these are some of the wise counsels that he had, right? Where it says that, Judas has been strong since his birth, that Jonathan is I forgot what it said, that he's brave, and Simon was a man of wise counsel. I'm roughly paraphrasing that, right? But some of this was part of that wisdom, where he was able to fortify and build some of these war engines, right? Engines of war, if you will. So let me go to that. We're going to go to 1 Maccabees chapter 13, verse 43. And this is the whole thing, like you have to read, reread, and you find different types of gems when you're on your little quest, right? So Simon leads the Jews. Let's go. First Maccabees chapter 13, verse 43. Let's get it. Okay. At that time, Simon laid siege to Gezer and surrounded it with his army. He built a movable siege platform and brought it up to the town wall, attacked one of the towers, and captured it. The man who had been on the siege in the platform then moved rapidly into the town, and this created great confusion. The men of the town, their wives and their children, bore their clothes in distress and climbed up on the top of the town wall. They pleaded loudly with Simon for a truce. Have mercy on us, they begged. Don't punish us as we deserve. Man, so we see, these people were fearful, right? Simon didn't play, he was wise. He built these engines, right? He surrounded Gezer, right? He built a movable siege platform. This is what, the Greeks and the Romans do, especially in 70 AD with the ballista, when they're throwing the stones at Jerusalem's walls. He was fighting fire with fire. So we see in Maccabees chapter 13, verse 43, they constructed, a shooting tower, called a helepolis, right? He besieged Acre and Jerusalem and forced the inhabitants to surrender, right? And that Gazara that was captured, thus giving us our independence, right? Retrieving back our lands, these engines of war, we use them at our advantage for some of our independence, right? And all, glory and victory comes from the Most High, but he has to put that wisdom in us for us to do that, right? So, First Maccabees chapter 13, verse 43. On a side note, graffiti found at Gezer from this time contains a plea, Pamphrus, may he bring down fire on the place of Simon. Okay. That's how much fear that he put into people, where they're writing things like that on the walls, right? It also reads too, in some of the history, and let me just get this for you, just bear with me real fast. Judas appears to have artillery machines during his unsuccessful attempt to take Acre. And we see that in First Maccabees chapter 6 and verse 20. You know, that we see these engines of war, right? Like we miss that when we read this, right? But I'm just making, you know, a point that we use wisdom and technology, you know, to fight some of these wars. Okay. When we go to First Maccabees chapter 6 and verse 20. That led up to, you know, how John, Hyrcanus, and Simon, you know, and their wars and the tools that they used, right? So we see Simon, we see his expansion of our territories, him building engines of war, right? And we're just going to get, you know, his brother doing the same thing. So we go to First Maccabees chapter 6 and verse 20. All right, and let's go to just real fast, make a point. Judah's engine of war. All right, so it reads. All right. Meanwhile, the enemies in the fort at Jerusalem have been blockading the people of Israel in that area around the temple, constantly causing them trouble and giving support to the Gentiles. So Judas decided to get rid of them and called all the people together to besiege the fort. The people assembled and laid siege to the fort in the year 150 BC. They built siege platforms and battling rams, right? So, you know, our people knew how to build things, right? Not only did we use the heathens' weapons for our advantage, but we built things ourselves, okay? And with Judas being, Judas and Jonathan were on the side. Don't forget that while Judas was running this, Simon and Jonathan were right there with him, right? So you know that Simon was a wise man, that he was putting a lot of his, you know, engineering skills into these weapons that they were building, right? You know, just, hey, everything comes together. These are just some of the weapons that, you know, we miss when we're reading this, right? That you have to paint this picture, that we had catapults, that we had battling rams, that we were using ballistas, right? Siege towers, all of that stuff, right? Our people were brave, fighting elephants, right? Study the history of the Greeks, Alexander the so-called Great, right? Taking elephants from Asia and India, right? And making those his own, training them. They used to feed those elephants alcohol, rallying them up to get mad and use them for war. You know, if you read about Eleazar stabbing one of the beasts, it says, with a spear, and the beast fell on him. That was a war elephant that he fell. We're going to get into that. Okay, so bear with me. Right, bear with me for a second as I get my notes. Right, so you know, we do know that Simon was the only one of his brothers that had children, right? And with that being little John Hyrcanus, right? So we're talking about Simon, you know, his influence in the military at the revolt, right? With him being brave, man of wise counsel, right? His descendants, his weapons that he used, his descendants, all the above, right? So John Hyrcanus, his role during Simon's reign and his consolidation of political and secular powers. John Hyrcanus was one of Simon's three sons, right? So you had John Hyrcanus, you had Mattathias the second, and you had Judah the second. So we know that, you know, in that bloodline, a lot of the names are often reused, right? This is just something that we have to keep in mind when we hear these names, that we don't get it twisted or get confused about it being, you know, Mattathias the first, right? The father of the Maccabees. Simon had 3 children: Mattathias II, Judas II, and John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus was one of Simon's 3 sons, right? So this is one thing that, if you get deeper into this and you read, you see that, he was the second in order of the birth, right? He wasn't the first. So, not that that's too important, but the history is good to go over, right? Yeah, he was the second. We go first to First Maccabees chapter 16. And get some of that, some of this history on John Hyrcanus. Okay. First Mac, chapter 16. And we'll read from 11, verse 23. And this shows that, like, the Most High chose John Hyrcanus to lead, because everything falls, in the hands of the Most High, and how things are created and are in order, right? Shalaki, I'm trying to distract anybody, but my son's on the games. We see that the movie Game of Thrones copies the Maccabees. They were killed at the banquet, right? That Simon and his 2 sons were killed, and his wife was killed. John Hyrcanus' mother, right? So we read from First Maccabees chapter 16. We'll take it from 11 to verse 23, and it reads. Okay, go talk to your mom, baby. Daddy's recording right now. Simon the high priest had appointed Ptolemy, son of Abubus, commander of the plain of Jericho. Ptolemy was very rich because he was Simon's son-in-law. But he became too ambitious and wanted to take over the country. So that's that greed, right? There's nobody as profane as Esau. So he devised a plan to assassinate Simon and his sons. Simon, together with his sons, Mattathias and Judas, was visiting the towns in the area in order to take care of their needs. They arrived in Jericho in the month of Shabbat, in the 11th month in the year 177. Ptolemy is still plotting to murder Simon and his 2 sons. And that says, he's killing his father-in-law and his brother-in-laws, right? Says he received them in a small fortress called Dok, which he had built. He gave a great banquet for them. Remember that when the king of the north and the Lannisters and the banquet, right? Closed the doors, played the Lannisters' music. The queen of the north said, "What is that music?" And then all the Lannisters soldiers came out and killed the king, the queen of the north and the sons, right? Remember that? Well, this is what this is, right? I'll read it again. He gave a great banquet for them, but he had men hidden within the fortress. When Simon and his sons were drunk, Ptolemy and his men came out of hiding with swords in hand and rushed into the banquet hall, where they killed Simon, his 2 sons, and some of the servants. With this horrible act of treachery, Ptolemy returned evil for good, right? So, never trust the enemy, just like iron rusted, so does his wickedness. That's what, Sirach says, right? All right. Then it reads, then Ptolemy wrote a report of what he had done and sent it to the king. In the letter, he requested that troops be sent to help him, and that the country and the cities be turned over to him. He wrote a letter to the army officers, inviting them to join him and promising them silver and golden gifts. Then he sent some of his men to Gezer to kill John, and others to take control of Jerusalem and the Temple Hill. But someone ran to Gezer ahead of Ptolemy's men and reported to John that his father and brothers had been killed, and the Ptolemy was sending his soldiers to kill him. See, right there, that's the work of the Most High God, setting up Jonathan to be the leader, right? John was horrified at this news, but because he had been warned in advance, he was able to capture and put to death the man who had been sent to kill him. So John Hyrcanus, he was given that name for putting in work. John of Hyrcania. It says that he got that name by taking over that place. Okay. All right. So we read. Now the rest of what John did from the time he succeeded his father, his wars, his deeds of courage and rebuilding of walls, and his other accomplishments are written in the chronicles of his reign as high priest. Fine, right? So let's get some notes, right? That we're going to go in deeper in this, okay? So we're going to Simon. We're going to him, how he got killed, from his son-in-law, right? How he got set up, to his military accomplishments, right? He got us more land, and there was a lot of peace at the time that he was reigning, right? So his descendants, you know, putting in the work, carrying the torch, all from Simon, right? Simon Maccabees. So share my screen once again. All right, I think I am right here. Yes, I am. Okay, get off of this. All right. So we read, okay. All right. All right, let's get it. High priest, John Hyrcanus, right? Yachanan, Johanan in the modern pronunciations, right? High priest, prince of the Hasmonean family, born about 175, died about 104. He was a wise and just ruler and skillful warrior. As a young man, he distinguished himself as a general in the war against the Syrian general Sennacherib, whom he defeated. That John was given the surname Hyrcanus on account of his victory. Is a tradition to which Gratz and others attribute historical significance. When his father Simon Maccabees was assassinated at Jericho by his son-in-law Ptolemy, John succeeded in escaping from those sent by Ptolemy to murder him. Also, from Gadara, where he at the time lived, John hastened to Jerusalem, where the people gladly received him as Simon's successor. He never assumed the people gladly, he never assumed the king a title, being content with that of a high priest. The beginning of his reign was not happy. He could not avenge the murder of his father, for Ptolemy, whom he had shut up in the fort Dagon, right? Which we read Dagon in the Old English, subjected Hyrcanus' mother to cruel tortures on the walls of the fort. Whenever her son attempted to attack it, Hyrcanus therefore raised the siege after several months, although his mother bore tortures with heroic determination and encouraged him to punish the murderer. Finally, however, she was put to death, as was presumably imprisoned brother also, while Ptolemy himself fled to Rabbath Ammon, right? So, you know, the father, the brothers, the mother was all put to death. You know, you don't read that in the scriptures, but, you know, these come from the writings of Flavius Josephus, right? These are just some more things that we could find, you know, that the mindset of Simon, right? That he's captured, you know, you're at a banquet, right? So say, you know, we're at the school, right? And all of a sudden, everybody's just comes out with swords. You see what I'm saying? Like, you're drinking, you're feasting, right? You're trusting a family, and they turn on you, right? John Hyrcanus, the bravery that he had. Can you imagine your father gets killed, your brothers get assassinated, your mother's being held hostage. You go and try to attack, and she's getting tortured, right? It says right here, his mother bore torturous, heroic determination and encouraged him to punish the murderer, right? We see the heroism of the mother. Not only the dad was solid, the mother was solid. Telling him to, punish the murderer, punish Ptolemy, right? The same bravery as the mother with the 7 sons, 2 Maccabees chapter 7, right? Man, it gets deep. It gets deep. So there's just some, like I said, some of the history things that we're covering. Bear with me. We see the bravery, we see the wisdom, we see how John Hyrcanus was meant to be a ruler by the Most High, that where his father, his wife, and his brothers had to die, he became the successor, right? But that's through the hands of the Most High, right? All the brothers die. Simon survives. He has a seed that carries the torch, right? A few seeds. Though a couple of those seeds die. John Hyrcanus still alive. Then he has a couple of seeds himself, and so on and so on, right? So, and this all has to do, with Simon and his descendants, right? His seed. All right, so let me continue my point, where we're going to go. All right. All right. It's just my AI things, but I think it makes it a little, more interesting, right? So, get to my next point. Some ancient writers believe this Greek name was given to him to commemorate his conquest of Hyrcania. Josephus does not record how old he was when he became high priest, but we can estimate that he was assumed this office when he was approximately 26 years of age. So, this is having to do more or less with Josephus' writing, right? If this proposal is correct, then a simple calculation reveals that he was born in 161 BCE. His place of birth was presumably Modin, right? Which was the ancestral home of his family, the Maccabees family, the location where several of them were buried. Okay. So we'll just get more history about that and how he got his name, right? This has to do with Simon and his descendants. Okay. Hyrcanus as high priest and political ruler. Simon's wife and 2 of his sons, Mattathias and Judas, accompanied him to Jericho on a tour to survey his realm. Hyrcanus was presumably occupied with his duties as a general of the Hasmonean forces stationed in Gezer. The royal entourage stopped in the fortress of Dot near Jericho to visit Simon's son-in-law Ptolemy, son of Abubus, right? So that's where the setup happened, right? First Maccabees chapter 16, verse 15 and 16. And I think we just covered that, okay? But it talks about, when you read the historical resources, right? Flavius Josephus, that they were, surveying a realm, okay? Checking it out, right? Let me get back to my scriptures real fast. Let me see what we just covered. Okay. 16, 15, and 16. Yeah, we just covered that. All right, so let me get to my next point. Okay. But the murder of Simon by Ptolemy, are uncertain because of our conflicting sources. So there's conflicting sources between Flavius Josephus and different types of historians, right? But this is where we have to go to the precepts, right? But it reads, what is clear is that Ptolemy had his men kill Simon and his whole entourage at a lavish banquet he put on his honor, right? The deed was committed while the guests were intoxicated. And who does that now, right? Who dies like that now? Tupac, I catch him slipping when they're coked up and weeded, right? Our people do that, right? Get to my next point. Bear with me. Let's see where we at. So we're covering the setup, right? The historical sources, right? About the assassination, having Simon and his entourage killed, right? There's still a number of books, they're still missing. For instance, John Hyrcanus is mentioned in First Maccabees chapter 16, verse 23 and 24. We have history books such as the Kings of Judah by Eupolemus, to further expand on this type of information that we're reading about, right? You have works by Flavius Josephus. You have works by Eupolemus entitled The Kings of Judah, to expound on these matters, right? You also have right here the history of the Hasmonean state, which is a good read, right? You can't AI everything, hey, you could get that with a nice foundation, structure, body, if you will, for what you're going to study, but just bring out your precepts and your historical resources, right? So we continue on. Bear with me. Okay. I'm going to jump a little bit. We'll go to my next point, right? We go to the next point. John Hyrcanus, his descendants, right? Who that was. Okay. Bear with me for a second. Let's see where I was. All right. All right. So we see, that Hyrcanus, he went through a lot. Okay. We see that he has descendants. Can you imagine that? Your father, you being yourself raised up in war, right? Then you have children, then you got to raise them up to be warriors also. We see that Simon had his sons, Mattathias the second, Judas the second, and John Yachanan, right? He had three, right? Simon gets killed, his wife gets killed, which is John Hyrcanus' mother. John Hyrcanus' two brothers get killed, right? John Hyrcanus is survivor, and Simon has grandchildren, right? We read in this war, Josephus writes that Hyrcanus sent his sons Aristobulus and Antagonus to besiege Samaria. Its inhabitants called upon Antiochus, the fourth Sisinnius. Sisinnius came to Hyrcanus' sons, defeated him and expelled him from the region. Right, so Hyrcanus' sons are already putting in work. So we know, that there is an Aristobulus. We know that there is Alexander Antagonist, right? So we see that, with these Greek names, this is starting to happen already, especially from John Hyrcanus and on, right? That we had, Hebrew names, Eleazar, Mattathias, right? Judas, Yachanan, Simon, just Simeon, right? We had all these Hebrew names, right? Then it goes to, taking the title of Hyrcanus, right? Aristobulus, Alexander Antagonist. We see, the Greek names starting to come into play. Okay, so Hyrcanus' sons defeated him and expelled him from the region. Aristobulus had Antagonist then captured Samaria and razed it to the ground and enslaved many of its inhabitants. Josephus includes a second story of Samaria's destruction in a later section of his Antiquities, right? And this is when you read the Antiquities of war, you got to go to the sources, the books of Josephus, right? The Kings of Judah by Eupolemus, things of that sort, right? You just search the way of the ancients, right? Our ancestors, right? Checking out the history. It reads in this story, he states that Hyrcanus sent his sons to attack the Sumerians because of their alliance with the Seleucid rulers. So we see our people that were Hellenized, that were becoming traitors, and there was catching it. That was payable by death, right? And their hostile actions against the territory he had colonized in Samaria. It was this event that he caused the Sumerians to request help from Antiochus, right? So our people are going to the oppressor for help, right? What does the scripture say? Envy not the oppressor or any of his ways, right? So let's go. After the sons of Hyrcanus defeated and expelled him from the region, he returned with additional forces supplied by Ptolemy. This bastard is still in the mix, right? Hyrcanus's men repelled both armies and captured Samaria after a siege of over 1 year. According to Josephus, and the Hasmonean troops destroyed the city. For Josephus, the Samaritans deserved their punishment for bringing a Seleucid ruler to that territory that rightfully belonged to the Hasmonean state. What state, to our people, right? Man. We got, man, this telling you, we're Hellenized, right? We also get that from First Maccabees chapter 1, right? That well, let's get it. You know where I'm going with it, so why don't we just go there, right? Okay. Boom, boom. All right. First Maccabees chapter 1. Let's go. All right. Come on. All right. It's funny. I gotta play with this computer a little bit before I make my videos because I'm so used to the iPhone that what you call it. Like you understand, I forget how to use the mouse and the zoom and share the screen and all that, right? But when we read about this, we see that renegade Jews, I think somewhere around here, right? Yeah, here it goes. First Maccabees chapter 1 and verse 11, and it reads, "At that time there appeared in the land of Israel a group of traitorous Jews who had no regard for the law and who had a bad influence on many of our people. They said, let's come to terms with the Gentiles, for our refusal to associate with them has brought us nothing but trouble," right? Scripture says, "He that endures to the end shall be saved." Scripture says, prepare the heart, that gold is tried in the fire, right? Roughly paraphrasing Sirach, the 2nd chapter. If you come to this truth, prepare thy soul for temptation, for gold is tried in the fire. But it says our people were treacherous, they were traitors, right? That associating with our people brought us nothing but trouble. This proposal appealed to many people, and some of them became so enthusiastic about it that they went to the king and received from him permission to follow Gentile customs, right? So we see our people were doing that, First Maccabees chapter 1 and verse 11. They're still doing it from that time all the way to Hyrcanus's time, right? So we keep reading, right? All right. All right. We see also too, that our people were Hellenized, right? So let me get to my next historical resource, right? All right. Quintus, Curtis, Rufus, Eusebius, Jerome, and Senilus all claimed that Samaritans revolted against Alexander the Great while he was in Egypt in 331 BCE. Alexander subsequently turned Samaria into a Macedonian military colony. Archaeologists have discovered skeletons of men, women, and children. And we have proof, right? The Wadi Ed Dalaya, along with pottery, clothing, papyrus documents, the date from 375, 335 BCE. So there's proof of that, right? These provide physical confirmation that Alexander retaliated against the Samaritans who had participated in the revolt. If the testimony of Pseudo Hesitius is factual, the Jews Slovakia may have played an active role in suppressing the Sumerian uprising. That's our own people, right? It's our own people, okay? That was prophesied in Daniel chapter 8, right? Okay. We go to this here. Bear with me for a second. Okay. Speaking of Daniel chapter 8, we could probably just get that real fast. All right. Bear with me for a second. We do this. Daniel chapter 8. All right. Bear with me for a second. Okay. All right. So let me get to my next point, right? All right. Let me get to my next point. Getting off the track here. So share my screen. Boom, boom, boom. All right. In Antiquities, Josephus emphasizes the history of the Jews to portray the Sumerians as apostles. His account of Alexander the Great visit to Jerusalem temple is intended to show that his shrine is superior to all others. Even Alexander recognized the importance of Jewish religion. Josephus claims and offered sacrificial sacrifice in Jerusalem's temple according to the high priest's direction. That's how these devils operate. They knew the power of our temples, right? The abominations, desolation that was prophesied in the book of Daniel, right? This is the right reason why they did it. It was prophesied, number one. Number two, these men are devils, and they figured that they're going to worship their gods at the power of our temples, right? So that's part of the reason why they profaned them. There's some things that we have to keep in consideration. We're coming to, you know, the history and the truth of this matter, right? Now, John Hyrcanus' sons that we know about would be Judah Aristobulus, Antagonist. Oh, I had that wrong. It's Alexander Genius, right? And Absalom, right? Josephus wrote that John's sons, Aristobulus and Antagonist, besieged Samaria around 11595 BCE. Our own people called for help that we read about with Antiochus, right? They ran to the oppressor for help. The brothers destroyed Samaria and killed those that were in alliance with the Seleucid rulers, right? So we went through that already, right? That we were Hellenized, right? That abominations, desolations prophesied in Daniel chapter 8. Okay. I get to my next point. Give me a second. Baba Kasha. Trying to set something up real quick. You gotta be quick with the sword, quick with these scriptures, right? And Quiet down, baby. All right. All right. All right. All right. 8 verse 20. I might as well get this for it. I mentioned it a couple of times. I might as well get this out. Let's go to Daniel chapter 8 verse 20. Because I mentioned it, but right, I gotta bring this out. Okay. Go back to scriptures. Okay. Go to Daniel chapter 8 verse 20. Man, I hope I have enough time for this. There's just so much information. I might have to do a part 2 on this. All right. Well, that didn't help. All right. Chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 verse 20. All right. Gabriel explains what the vision is, and let's see what that is, right? All right. Oops. All right, verse 20. Daniel's had a vision of a ram with 2 horns, right? And it reads, the ram you saw that had 2 horns represents the kingdoms of Media and Persia. The goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the prominent horn between his eyes is the first king, right? So we see that those prophesied in Daniel chapter 8, verse 20 about Alexander the Great, about him being one of those 4 beasts that was a leopard, right? So this is just what I was talking about, what was prophesied as abomination and desolation. I had to do with, the Seleucid rulers, the Greeks, if you will. So let me get back to my next point. All right. Slovakia. Okay. So let's get a little bit of background on these devils, right? Alexander, so-called great amongst the heathen, knew, like what we said, the importance of our temple, that they chose to sacrifice to their gods in our temple, right? The abomination of desolation, right? That's just how dirty they were and disrespectful. And after that they would raid our temples for the gold and the silver and take turns heating different temples, right? So it's just some things that we got to keep in consideration when we're breaking all this stuff down, right? So let's continue on. We see that, John Hyrcanus' sons already putting in work, right? Man. All right, so let's continue on. We see that John Hyrcanus' sons had 4 sons, right? Aristobulus and Antagonist, where they were putting in work, they're putting in mad work. Those are the ones that I mentioned, right? He had 4 sons that we just talked about, right? So like what I said, that would have been a Judas, Aristobulus, Antagonist, Alexander Genius, and Absalom, right? So let's get back to where we were. Right. We'll go to my next notes right here. Just bear with me real quick. I'm gonna change this pic. Okay. Boom. Yeah, baby.
My friend playing our house now again.
Yeah? Okay, leave him alone. All right, hold on, baby. I'm making a video right now, okay? All right. Josephus writes that John Hyrcanus was most favored by God as a Hasmonean ruler, right? There was great turmoil during his reign. And a lot of that had to do, with social unrest and rebellion from our own people, right? That he had to meet with violence. John was known for his military conquests and his diplomatic skills, just like Jonathan, his uncle, right? So he had the wisdom of his father and the diplomatic skills of his uncle and the bravery of the Hasmoneans, right? The bravery of the Maccabees. Those are just some things that, we're going to take care of, right? In my next study, we're going to cover Simon's grandsons, right? This is Simon and beyond. Simon got more of our land back. Simon had a lot of peaceful rulership under his watch. Simon was betrayed. Simon was a man of wise counsel. Simon had his descendants, John Hyrcanus' sons that were still putting in work and going to war, right? There's just some things that, we have to bring out, right? So, let me get to my next points real fast. Lord willing, we'll get some of this broken down, okay? Got notes upon notes. That's how we do this, right? So let's go. I'm bringing them out real quick. Bear with me. Boom. All right. No, that's not how we do this. We gotta see. I'm sharing my screen right now, but you can't see it. So when you go to Zoom, you gotta hit this share right here. Boom. For those that don't know how to do it, I gotta select my internet right here. Boom. Then I have to share it. See, now I'm highlighted green. I know it's being shared. I know you can see it, right? So let's go. To the works of Flavius Josephus, right? And we're going to read from chapter 2, and we're going to take it all the way to verse 4, I believe. Yeah, 2 through 4. All right. And let's read it. All right. And it reads, however, Simon managed the public affairs of a courageous manner and took Gazara. So we read about Gazara and Joppa earlier, right? And Joppa and Jamnia, which were cities in his neighborhood. He also got the garrison under and demolished the citadel, right? He was afterward an auxiliary to Antiochus against Trypho. So this is some of those alliances that they're forming, right? Whom he besieged at Dora before he went on his expedition against the Medes. Yet could not he make the king ashamed of his ambition, though he had assisted him in killing Trypho. For it was not long that Antiochus sent Senebius, which we read about, right? His general with the army to lay waste at Judea to subdue Simon. Yet he, though he was now in years, conducted the war as if he were a much younger man, right? And who else we see that? Look at Joshua, Caleb, right? He also sent his sons with a band of strong men against Antiochus, which he took part of the army himself with him and fell upon him from another quarter. He also laid a great many men in ambush in many places in the mountains and was superior in all his attacks upon them. And when he had been conqueror after so glorious a manner, he was made high priest and also freed the Jews from the dominion of the Macedonians. So we read about that too, that he freed the Jews and had some access, freed the access to those Greek islands that we read about in the book of Maccabees, right? It reads, after 170 years of the empire of the Seleucids, the Seleucids are the Greeks, okay? Verse 3, this Simon also had a plot laid against him and was slain at a feast by his son-in-law Ptolemy, who put his wife and 2 sons into prison. And we don't hear about what happened to his wife, right? But you have to read other historical sources. And check this out. And sent persons to kill John, who was called Hyrcanus. But when the young man was informed of their coming beforehand, he had haste to get to the city, as having a very great confidence in the people there, both on account of the memory and the glorious actions of his father, and the hatred that they could not bear, but injustice of Ptolemy. Ptolemy also made an attempt to get into the city by another gate, but was repelled by the people, who had just then admitted of Hyrcanus. So he retired presently to one of the fortresses that were about Jericho. This was called Dagon. Now, when Hyrcanus had received the high priesthood, which his father had held before him, had offered sacrifice to Yahweh, and made great haste to attack Ptolemy, that he might afford relief to his mother and brethren, right? So he was trying to rescue his mother and his brothers, right? But you know, I'm not sure both his brothers were dead, you know, but I know Simon was killed, and I think that the brothers and the mother were in prison. Verse 4. And it reads, so he laid siege to the fortress and was superior to Ptolemy in other respects, but was overcome by him as just as to the affection he had for his relations. For when Ptolemy was distressed, he brought forth his mother and brethren to set upon the wall. Right? You're coming to put in work. I got your mother, I got your brother. Psychological warfare, right? Stressing them out. And it reads, and beat them with rods in everybody's sight, and threatened that unless he would go away immediately, he would throw them down headlong, at which sight Hyrcanus' commiseration and concern were too hard for his anger. Can you imagine being the state of Hyrcanus, right? The son of Simon, seeing his mother being tortured, right? But his mother was not dismayed, neither at the stripes she received, nor at the death which she was threatened, but stretched out her hands and prayed for her son to be moved with the injuries that she suffered, to spare the wretch, since it was to her better to die by the means of Ptolemy than to live ever so long, provided he might be punished. So she wanted this man to be punished even through her death, is what it's saying, right? This is a bravery that she had, that the family had, right? For the injuries he done to their family. Now, John's case was this: when he considered the courage of his mother and heard her entreaty, he set about his attacks. But when he saw her beaten and torn to pieces with stripes, he grew feeble and was entirely overcome by his affections, right? How can any man deal with that? You have to ask yourself, right? We read about Mattathias, we read about Judas, we read about Jonathan, we read about Simon, we read about John Hyrcanus, we read about his sons, right? But we don't go into the mind that they had, that they're fleeing into the mountains, right? That people that are keeping the Sabbath that were getting killed, right? There's a joy that we have sometimes when we go in these neighborhoods and see our own people and their children, right? Especially when they come to the truth. But just to see them off the dope, just to see, you know, the corn man, the lota man, you know, they're happy, they're playing, right? They're little, right? There's a joy that you have when you see that. But to see your people tortured, right? To see your people, nowadays we see our people being sold, right? Whether it be sex trade, whatever, kidnapped, whatever. We see a lot of that stuff, especially around the border. You know, it breaks, you know, your heart to see that, right? See some of we're scattered all four corners. We see, you know, many impoverished countries along the equator, right? Sex traffic, kidnap. We see a lot of killings and kidnapping still, right? You could see what these people went through, seeing their people killed, seeing their family killed, seeing their brothers killed, seeing their mother killed, seeing, you know, their father killed, right? You have to just put your mind where John Hyrcanus is at scene right here, where it reads, you know, his mom, he saw her beaten and torn to pieces with stripes. He grew feeble. Who wouldn't grow feeble, right? Let's keep reading. And was entirely overcome by its affection. The siege was delayed by this means. The year of rest came, right? Sabbath, right? Upon the Jews rest every 7th year, as they do every 7th day. On this year, therefore, Ptolemy was freed from being besieged. So, you know, you have a right to defend yourself, but do you have the right to attack somebody? You know, we learned this off of forefathers, right? And slew the brethren of John with their mother and fled to Zeno, who was called Cotilius, who was the tyrant of Philadelphia, right? So we're going to end that right there. You know, it's just a point that I was trying to get, you know, about what's going on, the bravery that they had and what they went through, right? The reason why we honor Simon Maccabee as a memorial of Simon, right? This is just a different spin, different aspect, a different angle that we honor our forefathers, looking at the suffering and bravery that they had, right? Simon and his descendants, Simon and beyond. That's what we're covering, right? Yeah, my next point. Bear with me, Baba Shah, right? Let's get some of the engines of war, right? All right, so see if I can find it real quick. All right, and it reads, from a military standpoint, quiet down, baby. From a military standpoint, one of the greatest successes here is that they captured the engines of war. This is advanced war equipment for the time. We're talking about catapults, siege towers, battering rams, and the like artillery, the armaments, like these made possible attack the fortified cities and towns. These engines of war will make an appearance later in the story. Okay, it's long, hard march back to Judea, but the narrator says Judas kept relying the laggards and encouraging the people all the way until he came back to the land of Judah. So they went up to Mount Zion with joy and gladfulness and offered burnt offerings because they had returned safely, right? So, you know, we see this talking about Judas, right? It's talking about Judas, Jonathan, Simon, right? It's talking about all of them, their setbacks, but it talks about too, you know, that what they did with these engines of war, the type of engines of war that they had, battering rams, artillery, siege towers, catapults, all the above, right? So these catapults, we go to scriptures right here. Boom, the ballistas, right? All right. These would be some of the stones that they use in the catapults, right? That the Romans used to take down our walls, right? That we took from the Greeks and used against them, the Seleucid empires, right? So this would be around that time, 70 AD, right? Not too far, maybe 200-300 years away from, you know, from the Maccabees, right? 70 AD versus, you know, 100 BC. You know, we see that these stones right here were ballista stones, right? Used in the siege of Jerusalem. You know, that, but we just read that we had catapults, right? That we used. Okay. That was just mentioned right here. You know, so it's just some things that, you know, I wanted to share. You know, we had some of them siege towers that we were doing things like that, right? Okay. Also too, we see these wicked rulers are going to different areas and stealing our temples, right? That we had to defend, right? We get that in 1 Maccabees chapter 6 and verse 3. Let me see if I can find that real fast. Let's go to it. If this thing could load any quicker, I'd appreciate it. 1 Maccabees chapter 6 and verse 3. All right. Hit list. He is not behaving. All right. 1 Maccabees chapter 6. I'm almost done, baby.
Okay.
1 Maccabees chapter 6. We'll take in verse 3, I believe. All right, here it goes. Antiochus came and tried to take the city and loot it, but he didn't succeed because the citizens had learned what he was planning to do. They drew up their troops and resisted him in great frustration. He withdrew and to return to Babylonia, right? So when he was coming to the cities, what he was coming to loot. What was he coming to loot? He was coming to loot our temples. Where do we put our silver and gold at? We put it in the temples. Where do we put like our golden shields, things like that? We put them in the temples. That's what he was coming to do, right? So I just want to hit that real fast, right? Let me get to my next point. All right. All right, so battle elephants. Let's get to that. It's what some of our forefathers had to deal with, right? Let me go to the pictures. Don't don't come up here for me to be crying, baby. All right. All right. Okay. Screen, get back to where I was. Turn it right here. All right. So this one, but this one. All right. This might be it. All right. Keep going down. Here we go. The big battle, drunken elephants, right?
Elephants.
All right. All right. So we'll get this a little bit. Let's go to it. This is what the enemies were using on our people, right? And it reads, the king was enraged when he heard of this. He assembled all his friends, the commanders of the forces, and these authorities, mercenary forces also came to him from other kingdoms, from the islands and the seas. The numbers of his forces were 100,000 foot soldiers, 20,000 horsemen, and 32 elephants accustomed to war, right? Now it reads right here, before the battle, the Seleucids gave the elephants wine to intoxicate them for the fight, right? All right, let's continue on. And it reads, the Jews found the sight of the army arrayed against them, elephants, cavalry, phalanxes, overwhelming. This was the biggest, baddest army they've ever faced. When the sun shone on the shields of golden brass, the narrator says the hills were ablaze with them, gleamed like flaming torches. All who heard noise made by the multitude, by the marching of the multitude and the clanking of the arms, trembled, for the army was very large and strong. Judas and his men advanced, but were no match. After an initial sortie, they turned back and retreated to Jerusalem. This is the type of fights that our forefathers were dealing with, war elephants, right? And it reads, they turned back and returned to Jerusalem. One particular soldier made a valiant effort before the retreat. Eleazar spotted the biggest elephant of the bunch. Assuming that was the king's, he ran right through the enemy, slashing left and right until he reached the beast. He stabbed it from beneath and killed it, but was crushed when the animal collapsed on him, right? So we see these beasts I was talking about was war elephants in the book of Maccabees, right? Where do we get that at? Let's go to the scriptures. First Maccabees chapter 6, we're going to go to 43. And it reads, all right. Here we go. Judas and his army advanced into battle, and immediately 600 of the king's army, and killed 600 of the king's army. When Eleazar Averon saw that one of the elephants was larger than the others, and that it was covered with royal armor, he thought that it was a king riding on it. Eleazar sacrificed his life to save his people to gain eternal fame. So this man was doing it for vanity. It says, he ran boldly towards the elephant, which was in the middle of the battalion of infantry. He rushed forward, killing men right and left, so that the enemy soldiers fell back before him on both sides. He slipped in under the elephant and stabbed it to death, and it fell on him and killed him. But when the Jews realized how strong the royal army was and how determined it was to fight, they retreated, right? So when you read in the book of Maccabees, there was two men that fought to of the wrong reasons, get themselves a name, but it was not given to them, but to the family, the Hasmoneans. And that's a different story, you know. So we're just reading this, you know, and comparing it with the scriptures, right? So let's go to one more, my last one. I'm going to finish it off with this, right? Let's get back to these drunken elephants that they got them drunk and they would be violent. And the ones that reacted violently, that didn't go too crazy, they would keep them for war. The ones that can control it, you know, just like people, they wouldn't give them elephants any more wine. They would feed the wine to the elephants and see which ones that were ready for war. That's how they did these things, right? So we go to the my next historical resource, and I'll do that by sharing my screen once again. Okay, this could be my last point. Boom, boom. All right, so let's go to it. A little history we're getting down today, right? All right, let's read it. Drunken killer elephants of antiquity. Ptolemy was certainly not the only despot in the ancient world to have drunken killer elephants at his disposal. Ptolemy had them too. Alexander the Great was doing all this stuff, right? The four generals, right? That's prophesied with Alexander the Great, and I think the leopard and the four wings has to do with his generals. Ptolemy, Seleucid, Lysimus, and there's one more out of my head. It's not coming to me right now, right? But it reads, they are certainly not unique to this story. In fact, they appear to the story of Hanukkah when Antiochus brings his herd into battle against the Maccabees, and Eleazar heroically leaps into action, killing a number of massive beasts before being his demise in their dung. He was crushed by them, right? Since Alexander the Great was first brought war elephants back with him from his conquests in the east, they quickly became a symbol of Greek power and reach with Hellenistic control, ultimately encompassing the native habits of both African and Asian elephants. The Asian got some big elephants, I'll tell you that much, right? So we keep reading, and let me still get to my next point. See where I'm at here. Remembering redemption. All right, let me see. All right, here we go. All right, here we go. It reads this now. And again, against Apion, which was Hellenized Egyptian. The famous Roman Jewish historian Josephus reports that an angry Ptolemy once ordered a mass execution of Alexandria's Jews at the feet of his drunken elephants as punishment for their siding with his rivals Cleopatra II, whose two leading generals were themselves Jews, right? So this is just more history we see, with our people being Jews, right? Being generals for the other people, right? So, that's another story too. But I just wanted to cover, these war elephants, they were getting trained with alcohol, right? Towards our people, trampling our people, that what Judas Maccabees went through, that Eleazar was in the battlefield with him, trying to get a name for himself, right? That Simon went through, that John Hyrcanus went through, that his children went through, right? This is, man, you talk about the fight, the courage, the bravery, the wits that you had to have, that what you're dealing with mighty strong armies and elephants, that would be like going to war with a 22 against somebody that has a tank, pretty much. That's what you're dealing with, right? You see the movie Saving Private Ryan, how they had the sticky bombs. They used to walk on the tanks and put the sticky bombs on the tanks. That's the type of bravery that our people were dealing with, right? But in righteousness, so this is just some historical topics I want to go through, having to deal with our forefathers, Simon Maccabees, as we see Memorial Simon coming, that he was a man of wise counsel, to his sons, that he was killed, his wife was killed, John Hyrcanus and his brothers were killed. John Hyrcanus wasn't killed. He survived it. He was in a different city when they were serving. We're just going through this stuff that John Hyrcanus tried to rescue his mother and punish Ptolemy a few times, right? But what happened? Ptolemy was torturing his mother, tearing her to pieces and stripes, like whipping her, right? In front of him. These are just some things that, our forefathers went through, right? the bloodline of Simon, you know, going down to John Hyrcanus to his grandchildren, right? John Hyrcanus's 4 sons that we just read about not too long ago, right? And those names, I got them right here. Bear with me one more time. All right. That would have been Judah Aristobulus, Antigonus, Alexander Janneus, and Absalom. You know, and we're just covering Simon and his descendants, Simon and beyond, Simon and his engines of war, siege towers, ballistas, catapults, right? Jonathan, Simon enlarging our borders and our territories, right? This is just, you know, as we commemorate our forefather, you know, on what his accomplishments were and his deeds, his bravery and sacrifice. And Lord willing, this lesson was edifying. This is your brother Abad Zakar from True Nation Congregation of Fresno. And Lord willing, this is edifying, and I'm out.